All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So welcome to our weekly uh, class Zoom meeting for Political Science 1, class number 30672. My name is Paul Savoy, and it is Monday. It's the 18th day of May, 2020. And several things we're going to accomplish over the next 45 minutes. In just a couple of minutes, I'll give you some announcements and reminders. We'll talk a little bit about the remaining schedule for the course over the next few weeks as we get ready to wrap things up, because I know it by this point it probably feels like this semester's been going on for about the last 2 years, but not really. And actually, we will have things wrapped up relatively soon. The last day of the semester, of course, is Wednesday, June 3rd. So we'll talk about some important dates and some important reminders between now and then. Then I will deal with any questions that any of you might have who are with me live, dealing with this week's discussion forum post assignment, which deals with the last of the three national government branches created by the framers in Article 3 of the Constitution. That is the judicial branch, the federal court system. And if you're with me during our weekly Zoom meeting last Monday, I gave you some highlights from the Canvas class notes that I posted on the judicial branch. So I'll deal with any questions that you might have today about the courts. Hopefully, now that you've had a chance to look at those notes in more detail, you've had a chance to look at the assigned readings on the judiciary and also looked at the 3 crash course videos that I provided the judicial branch as well. And of course, remember, all of this is in aid of our discussion forum post assignment for this week, which deals specifically with the judicial branch, even more specifically with concept of judicial review, which we talked a little bit about during our meeting last week. And remember, that discussion forum post on the judiciary is due on Wednesday. That is May 20th at 11:59 p.m., of course, not counting the 3-day grace period. And then finally, I'll spend the rest of my time with you this morning talking a little bit about the information that you were going to be learning about this week once you finish up with the federal judicial branch. And that is talk a little bit, kind of in a sense, bring this class full circle to where we started at the beginning of the semester with our first major course theme, and take a look at the nature of the basic freedoms that we have as folks living in the United States. So we'll talk about our related yet distinct freedoms in this country, civil liberties and civil rights. So I'll highlight some of the notes that I have posted up for you on Canvas dealing with civil liberties and civil rights. And that should easily get us through until 8:45 this morning. So before we do anything else, let me just remind you, of course, that this meeting is being recorded, as are all of our weekly Zoom course class meetings. And if you want to this meeting or any of the meetings we've done this semester, all or in part, all you have to do is click on our Canvas homepage. Click on the ConferZoom link in the left-hand main menu on that main class homepage. And then once you get to the ConferZoom page, click on the recordings link, and then you can scroll down, look at the date of the recording that you want to review, click on that, and go from there. Also, remember, if you have a question or a comment at any time during our meeting this morning, please feel free to either unmute your mic, ask your question, make your comment, or if you'd rather, go ahead and put your question or comment in the group chat, and I can deal with it from there. All right. So first of all, as far as announcements and reminders go, as I said, we don't have that many weeks left in the semester. We are really starting to get into the home stretch. And you should have received a Canvas message from me towards the end of last week, reminding you about one really important upcoming due date, and that, of course, is the Students' Choice Project, that semester-long project that we introduced at the very beginning of the semester, the second class meeting of the semester, back when we were still meeting face-to-face in the T building on the liberal arts campus of Long Beach City College. Now, remember, once we went fully online, I did go ahead and make some important modifications, some important revisions to the Students' Choice Project. So if you haven't yet started working on the Students' Choice Project, you definitely want to go ahead and take a look at it. And if it's been a while since you've worked on it, you probably want to go back and take a look at it as well. Some of the major revisions that I made, I went ahead and I reduced the minimum page requirement for the project because I thought that was fair. You know, once we got thrown into this fully online environment, I also further reduced the minimum page requirement for those of you who were originally supposed to be doing the BLAST service learning option for our Students' Choice project. So check out the project guidelines to take a look at that. I also went ahead and added 2 additional topic options for the project once we moved fully online. So you have lots of choices. If you haven't yet started working on your Students' Choice project, you have lots of choices how you can go about fulfilling it. But please make sure that you check it out. You can find the guidelines for the Students' Choice project simply by clicking the assignment link on the left-hand main menu on our Canvas class homepage, and then scroll down to where it says Students' Choice Project Revised. Click on that, and you will find that information all there for you. Remember, the Students' Choice Project is an important component of your final course grade. It is worth 110 points, so it is significant. And so you do want to go ahead and do a serious job working on it. And if you have any questions about the Students' Choice Project between now and its due date, and remember, it is due a week from this coming Wednesday, not this Wednesday, but a week from this coming Wednesday. That is Wednesday, May 27th at 11:59 p.m. But also remember that the 3-day grace period for all of the assignments in this class this semester does also apply to the Students' Choice project. So you do have those extra 3 days to complete the project and submit it to me without a lateness penalty if you need it. But if you have any questions, any problems with the Students' Choice project between now and the due date on the 27th, please do not hesitate to contact me. You can send me an email. You can send me a Canvas message. You can drop by during my twice weekly virtual student hours, which are every Monday and Wednesday afternoon between 2:30 and 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. If you want to go ahead and join those student hours, and again, I'll be having the next installment of those this afternoon from 2:30 to 3:30. All you have to do is go on to our main class Canvas page, the main page, scroll down past the pictures to where it says basic course information. There you will find the Zoom link for my weekly student hours, and you will also find the password that you will need to enter to join those virtual student hours. And if you want to meet with me face-to-face via Zoom, but you're not able to make the twice weekly student hours because it conflicts with a work schedule or another class or something like that, just shoot me a Canvas message or an email. We can set up a time for a meet via Zoom, and I can create a custom link for that, send you the link plus the password, and we can go from there. So that is the first important due date that you should be concerned about as we are wrapping things up this semester. Again, project due Wednesday, May 27th. And then after that, the other major sort of milestone, actually the last assignment that we will have due for this class for this semester, is test number 3. And last week I did go ahead and put up test number 3 up onto Canvas. That assignment is now open and available to you. You can check it out whenever you want to. And as you will notice, the format for test number 3 is the exact same format as we used for test number 2. So the same 2 parts. Answer any 8 of the 23 terms I have listed there in part 1 in about 3 to 4 sentences each. Give me a definition for each term. Tell me the significance or the importance of each term. And each of those 8 terms in part 1 is worth the usual 7.5 points. And that gets us to 60 points possible for part 1. And then there is the mini essay section, as always, in part 2. When you take a look at test number 3, you'll see that I've given you 4 possible mini essay questions to work on. Answer any one of those questions in approximately 5 paragraphs, maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less, depending on what you need to do to answer all the elements of the question thoroughly. And that approximately 5-paragraph essay in part 2 is worth the remaining 40 points possible for part 2 of the test. So exact same format as test number 2. And, as you will notice, and by the way, you can access the test. Again, click on the assignments tab on Canvas on our main class homepage. Scroll down to test number 3. You will find it there. And that assignment is due on the very last day of the semester for us. That is Wednesday, June 3rd at 11:59 p.m. But also remember, the grace period does apply for test number 3 as well. So technically, the assignment is due Wednesday, June 3rd at 11:59 p.m., but you have actually until June 6th to actually submit the assignment to me via Canvas. And if you get it done into me by June 6th at 11:59 p.m., I will not deduct any points for lateness. So that's it. So between now and June 3rd, you've got 4 assignments. You have 2 discussion forum posts, right? The one due this Wednesday on the judicial branch, the one due next Wednesday dealing with civil liberties and civil rights. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then, of course, the Student's Choice Project due next Wednesday, and test number 3 due the following Wednesday, the very last day of the semester for us. And again, all of the due dates, all of that information is available on our Canvas page for this class. And if you have any remaining questions, like I said a few minutes ago, please reach out. Send me a Canvas message, send me an email, stop by during my virtual student hours, do whatever you need to do to get your questions answered. So at this point, are there any questions about any of that? Any general questions about the class for the remainder of the semester going forward? Anything at all before we move on and deal with any questions that you might have about our discussion forum post that is due this week, this Wednesday, dealing with the judicial branch? So any general questions about the class at this time? You can either unmute your mic and ask or put a question in the group chat. Anybody? Okay, seeing and hearing nothing. Let's go ahead and move forward. And if you recall, if you were with me last Monday morning, we talked in some detail about the federal judicial branch, the federal court system, the last of the 3 national government branches created by the framers in Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution. And so I highlighted some important points from the judicial branch notes from last week. And if you recall, the 2 really main things that I talked about during that discussion was, first of all, I emphasized the fact that the framers themselves, when they sat down to create the structure and function of the federal court system in Article 3 of the Constitution, put barely any detail about the courts in Article 3 at all. Article 3 is by far the most brief and the most vague of the first three articles of the Constitution that describe the structure and function of the 3 national government branches. Article 3 is barely there. And as we explained last week in the notes, there are a couple, or in the discussion of the notes and in the notes, I guess, there are a couple of reasons why the framers decided not to really sweat the details on the courts at all in Article 3. One reason, as we talked about last week, was the fact that the framers didn't fear the courts. They really didn't feel that there was much chance at all of U.S. federal courts becoming overly powerful, overly dangerous, abusing their power, taking away people's natural rights, threatening democracy, anything like that. The framers, as we said last week, believed that the courts were the least powerful and the least dangerous of the 3 national government branches. That's one reason why. You don't need to put a lot of detail, because there was no need in the framers' minds to try and box the courts in, to try and limit the power of the courts by very carefully specifying what they could and couldn't say in Article 3. There was no need for that, because they just didn't fear the courts abusing their power. But remember, we said there was one other important reason why the framers didn't see the need to sweat the details in Article 3, And that's because the framers just basically were making a big assumption. The framers assumed that the federal court system would simply be a duplicate, a copy of the British court system. And we talked a little bit about why the framers had that expectation last Monday. We said that the British court system was the only element of the British government that the framers actually liked and trusted, that the framers didn't actually fear. Because remember what we said last week and at the beginning of the semester in class when we were still back face to face. We said that, for the most part during the colonial period, especially from about 1860, from 1760 to 1776, the framers didn't trust the British king. They didn't trust the British Parliament, the British version of Congress, but they did highly trust the British courts. They felt like the British judicial system was the only part of the British governmental system that was treating the colonists, the American colonists, fairly like any other British citizen. So because of that, when they sat down to create our current Constitution, 1787, they made our governmental system under the Constitution as different from, as distinct from the British governmental system as they could, with the exception of the courts, because they actually liked and trusted the British court system. So it makes sense. If the framers assumed that our court system was just going to be a copy of the British model, why waste the time and detail writing all this stuff down in Article 3? Now, the reason why all that was important for us, as we said last week, is because Article 3 is so darn brief and so darn vague, because the framers put so little detail about the structure and function and powers and process of the courts into Article 3, the U.S. Supreme Court, the highest court within the federal court system, very early on in our history under the Constitution, by 1803, took advantage of that lack of detail in Article 3, and they invented a massive power for themselves that we talked a little bit last week, and that is the main subject of our discussion forum post today, and that's due on Wednesday, I should say, and that is this power that we call judicial review. Because again, the framers probably did not intend for the courts to have this power. Article 3 doesn't say the courts can do it, but it also doesn't say the courts can't do it. And that's how the Supreme Court got away with creating this power in that very famous Supreme Court decision in 1803 called Marbury versus Madison. And remember, as we talked about last week, judicial review has two main parts. The first part of this judicial review power gives the federal courts the authority, and in the end, gives the U.S. Supreme Court the final authority to interpret the actual words of the U.S. Constitution. So the courts under judicial review, they're the ones who get to tell us what the actual words of the Constitution mean for us in reality, in practice. And as we said last week, that in itself is a major power that the courts created for themselves. But that's only half of the story. Because remember, the second part of judicial review that we talked about last time creates an even more massive power for the courts. Because what it says is that the courts, and again, the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court has the last word on this, the courts can strike down, can kill, can get rid of any governmental action that they believe conflicts with their interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. So in other words, if the federal courts believe that some part of our governmental system, whether it's the president or Congress at the national government level, or whether it's any of the 50 state governments, if they believe that some part of our governmental system has taken an action that goes against what they believe the Constitution says and means, the court can go ahead and kill that action, strike it down, and it goes away like it never existed in the first place. And as we said last week, That was a real game changer for the courts. The courts could no longer be seen as being the least powerful and the least dangerous of the three national government branches. And I mentioned briefly last week how this judicial review power basically regularly transforms our lives as folks living in the United States. How? Why? Well, we're going to pick up more on that in a few minutes, because here's the thing. As we'll talk about in a couple of minutes, when we talk about civil liberties and civil rights, when we talk about the basic freedoms that we have as folks living in the United States, how do we know what our basic freedoms are? How do we know what our civil liberties and civil rights consist of? Well, guess what? They're all listed, they're all written down, some more specifically than others, in various parts of the US Constitution. Now, that's a really important point, because here's the deal. Because all of our freedoms, because all of our civil liberties and civil rights are listed in different parts of the Constitution, that means that in the end, the federal courts, especially the US Supreme Court, have the ultimate authority to tell us what our freedoms mean and what our freedoms consist of and how far they extend and how much government can limit them under different circumstances, right? Because judicial review, the courts can interpret all parts of the Constitution and strike down any government action that goes against them. So in the end, the courts tell us what our freedoms are. And as we'll talk about a bit later on, over time, because remember, the Constitution's been around since 1789 in the United States, and over time, the Supreme Court will change its mind. Over time, throughout our history, the courts will sometimes reinterpret some of our basic freedoms, including some of our most fundamental freedoms, like our right to free speech, and also some of our most important civil rights. Recognize that it wasn't until the mid-1950s that the US Supreme Court said that it was illegal for governments to separate various public facilities like schools on the basis of race. Realize that up until the mid-1950s, and actually a bit later in a lot of parts of the country, especially in the Deep South, there were school districts that had two separate sets of public schools, one for Caucasian kids and one for kids of color. That was the United States in the middle of the 20th century. And that just is one really important example that you'll learn more about this coming week, about how the courts, using this judicial review power, do go through and do significantly reinterpret our basic freedoms. And whenever the courts reinterpret our basic freedoms, they can transform our lives. Realize that it wasn't until 2015, so it wasn't until about less than 5 years ago, that marriage in the United States was restricted only to couples of different gender identities. So up until 2015, only men and women could legally marry in the United States. But in 2015, in a case that I talk about in the civil rights notes that I've posted for you in Canvas, a case called Obergefell versus Hodges, the US Supreme Court said no, that we should all be treated equally under the law. That's what the 14th Amendment to the Constitution says. And therefore, if couples of different gender identities are legally allowed to marry in all 50 states, then same gender couples should also be able to legally marry in the United States. So this shows you, again, what a game changer judicial review is, because frequently over time, the courts will reinterpret our freedoms using judicial review and change our lives as folks living in the United States. So that's pretty much what we highlighted, what we talked about last time, dealing with the federal courts. So hopefully since last Monday, you've had a chance to read through those judiciary notes from Canvas in detail. Hopefully you've also had a chance to take a look at the assigned reading that I gave you on the judiciary in some detail. And hopefully you've also had a chance to read the 3 crash course video, or to watch the 3 crash course videos that I gave you for the judicial branch as well. So at this point, are there any leftover questions about anything having to do with the judicial branch, either from the notes, from the readings, from the videos, or any questions specifically about the discussion forum post on the judiciary that is due this coming Wednesday, the 20th of May, at 11:59 p.m. So any questions about the judicial branch or comments, feel free to unmute your mic, ask your question, make a comment, or if you'd rather, put your question or your comment in the group chat. So anything at all on the federal courts. Okay, great. Thank you very much. What I want to do for the remainder of our time today, for the remaining like 18 minutes or so that we have left, is to spend some time highlighting the class notes that I posted for you on Canvas, dealing with the topic that we'll be dealing with between now and next Wednesday. That is the 27th of May. And that is, by the way, the very last discussion forum post that we will be doing for this class, for this semester. And this is where, in a sense, as I said at the beginning of the Zoom meeting this morning, this essentially is where we bring the class back full circle. Because if you think back to the very, actually, I think probably our 3rd class meeting of the semester, the beginning of the 2nd week back, it seems like a couple of years ago, but really it was only back in early February, our 3rd class meeting, when we started talking about 3 of the major themes of the class, 3 of the big ideas that we were going to be encountering a lot during the course of the semester. And if you recall, the very first of those 3 major course themes went something like this. I asked this question. I asked, is it possible to understand the entire political history of the US as being a struggle between freedom and order? Remember that? And so the basic point was, can we understand how our governmental system in the United States, how and when and why it's evolved and changed over time, simply by understanding the interaction in American society between 2 fundamental forces, freedom on the one hand and order on the other. And if you recall, we went through and spent a fair bit of time in class trying to, first of all, define and understand what we meant when we talked about freedom in the context of the United States, but also what we meant dealing with order. And we had a really good discussion about those things at the time. And what we realized is that it could be really hard to come to a lot of agreement as to what we mean when we talk about such really important concepts as freedom and order. And this theme of freedom versus order has come up a lot since then. It's come up in a lot of different contexts throughout the course of the semester. And so it only makes sense that the idea that we start with at the beginning of the semester, we actually finish with at the end of the semester. So we're kind of bringing this class full circle. Because here's the thing. As I said a few minutes ago in talking about judicial review, we have lots of freedoms as folks living in the United States. As a matter of fact, one of the things that the United States is known for around the world and has been known for around the world historically is that folks living in the United States are said to have more freedoms than anybody else in the world, pretty much. Now, as I said, how do we know what those freedoms are that we have as folks living in the United States? Well, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, in conjunction with the judicial review power, all of our freedoms that we have as folks living in the United States are listed in different parts of the US Constitution. And guess what? Because they're all listed in the Constitution, as we said a few minutes ago, those freedoms are subject to change. The courts will reinterpret our freedoms using their judicial review power. And if you think about it, that really connects back to what we were saying about our first major course theme, freedom versus order, right? Because remember what we said. We said maybe it's possible to understand how our government has changed and evolved over time by understanding the interaction between freedom and order. And if you recall at the time, I went on to say that generally speaking, government tries to maintain as many of our freedoms as it can, but during times of major national crisis, when it feels necessary to do so, government will actually shrink our freedoms. They'll decrease our freedoms and increase order. And then when things calm down again in society, what can they do? They can increase our freedoms once again and decrease order. So freedom and order have been in kind of this seesaw, sort of this reciprocal relationship throughout our history under the US Constitution, right? So here's the thing. We want to get a handle this week, a better idea of what our freedoms consist of, how we know what they are, and how they have changed over time. And so I've given you two sets of notes I opened up last week the Canvas module on civil liberties and civil rights, and I posted two sets of notes there. The first one is a side-by-side comparison of civil liberties and civil rights, kind of giving you the basic information for each of those. And then the second set of notes is called Civil Rights Overview. And that's where I talk about civil rights in a bit more detail and give you a really nice historical way of understanding how and when and why our civil rights as folks living in the United States have changed and evolved. And so the main thing that I want to accomplish with you during our remaining few minutes together this morning is to make sure that we are clear on the distinction between civil liberties and civil rights. Because here's the thing, as folks living in the United States, we do have two different types of freedoms: civil liberties on the one hand and civil rights on the other hand. Now, here's the thing. Both civil liberties and civil rights describe our basic freedoms. So in that sense, civil liberties and civil rights are very similar terms, but they are not exactly the same thing. The terms civil liberties and civil rights can't be used or shouldn't be used interchangeably because they don't mean the same thing. They are similar terms, but they are distinct terms at the same time. And the reason why I emphasize that to you at the beginning of our discussion this morning is because so often when you hear our elected officials, members of Congress, talk about our basic freedoms, when you hear folks in the news media talk about our basic freedoms or report on our basic freedoms, oftentimes they make a very basic and fundamental mistake. They forgot what they should have learned in Poli-Sci 1. And that is that civil liberties and civil rights are not the same thing. Now, the best way to understand civil liberties and civil rights, or the best way I should say to understand the relationship between civil liberties and civil rights, is to think of them as being two sides of the same coin. So they are similar, they are connected, yet they are distinct, they are different from each other. Because think about it. Think about any coin that you might have in your pocket or purse. And I realize it's kind of difficult to see, on camera. But let me see if I can put this kind of close to the camera. So if you take a look, there's a quarter. There's the front side of the quarter, right? And then if I flip it over, there's the back side of the quarter, right? So there are different scenes, different images, different pictures embossed onto each side of the coin. So each side of the coin looks different from each other. But at the same time, the two sides of the coin are also very much connected to each other, right? There's no way that I can go ahead and take my fingernail and split the two sides of the coin apart from each other. That's impossible. Even if I had a really precise laser saw or cutter or something like that, it'd probably be really hard for me to do this. I'd probably melt the coin in the process before I was able to separate the two sides from each other. And so that really is the best way to understand the relationship between civil liberties and civil rights. Again, both civil liberties and civil rights describe our basic freedoms, but they describe our basic freedoms in essentially opposite ways. So they are similar concepts, they are connected concepts, but they are in fact distinct concepts. So now that you know that, you won't make the same mistake that members of Congress make. You will not make the same mistake that supposed experts in the news media make. And if you ever want to tell someone about this, impress your friends, impress your family, just whip out a coin and talk about it in the way that I did. So does that make sense so far? Any questions or comments about anything that I've said about civil liberties and civil rights, how they are essentially two sides of the same coin? Unmute your mic or put it in the group chat. Okay, great. There you go. I'll put away my very expensive prop. Okay, now, if you take a look at the first set of notes that I posted for you on Canvas, and that is the general comparison of civil liberties and civil rights, you'll notice when you pull up those notes that the notes are divided into, I have a table with two columns. On the left-hand column of the table, I talk exclusively about civil liberties. On the right-hand column of the table, I talk exclusively about civil rights. And the main point that I want to get through right now is to help you understand the basic distinction, the opposing relationship between civil liberties and civil rights, and to also recognize that civil liberties and civil rights are discussed in different parts of the US Constitution. So, first of all, if you take a look at the very top of the left-hand column of the notes, at the very top of the civil liberties column, you see I give you a couple of basic definitions of civil liberties. First, the more fancy, more formal definition, followed immediately by a much more simplified definition. So look what it says there. Again, the top of the left-hand column of the notes, the two ways of defining civil liberties. We can define civil liberties, first of all, as being limits on governmental actions restricting our basic freedoms. Listen to that again. Civil liberties are limits on governmental actions restricting our basic freedoms. Now, that is a fancy way of saying a very basic but a very important thing. The other way, the more simplified way that we can define civil liberties is to say that civil liberties are things that government cannot do to us. Listen to that again. Civil liberties are things that government cannot do to us. In other words, what civil liberties tell us is that there are certain basic freedoms that all of us are granted simply by virtue of the fact that we live in the United States. In most cases, it's not even a question of citizenship, right? In most cases, even if you are not a US citizen and you are living in the United States, you are still entitled to these civil liberties. There are still these basic freedoms that you have that government is not supposed to be able to take away from us. For example, we are said to have a right to free speech, that we should be able to say what we want, when we want, how we want, where we want, and to whom we want, without government interfering, without government trying to shut us up, essentially, right? So our right to free speech, our right to free expression is one of the most fundamental, one of the most important of our civil liberties. And it's a civil liberty because we're saying, okay, government under most circumstances cannot take away our right to say what we want, when we want, how we want, where we want, and to whom we want. So you see how that works? Do you see what civil liberties are? Basic freedoms that we have that government is not supposed to be able to take away from us under most circumstances. Now, as we talked about at the beginning of the semester, though, there is no such thing as an absolute freedom. So when you go through and read more about the civil liberties notes, connected with this whole freedom versus order thing, you'll recognize that there are times when government can take away, when government can limit our civil liberties in certain ways. But most of the time, government is supposed to keep its hands off of our civil liberties. That's why we say that civil liberties are things that government cannot do to us. Basic freedoms that government cannot take away from us most of the time. So does that make sense? Does everybody kind of understand that basic definition for civil liberties? Any questions so far about civil liberties? Okay. Now, civil rights, on the other hand, is the opposite side of the coin from civil liberties. Civil rights are similar to civil liberties. They are connected to civil liberties, but they are very, very distinct, very, very different from civil liberties. Why? Because they're the opposite side of the coin. So if you take a look at the very top of the right-hand column of your notes, the civil rights column, you see civil rights are essentially the opposite of civil liberties. Because look what it says. I give you two definitions there for civil rights, a fancy one and a simplified one, right? Listen to the fancy definition. Civil rights represent positive actions that government must take to prevent our basic freedoms from being harmed by others. Listen to that again. Civil rights are positive actions that government must take to prevent our basic freedoms from being harmed by others. In other words, civil rights represent things that government must do for us. Listen to that again. Civil rights are things that government must do for us. So it's the exact opposite of civil liberties, right? Because civil liberties, we said, those are things that government cannot do to us, right? Freedoms that government's not supposed to be able to take away from us. Civil rights, on the other hand, are things that government must do for us. In other words, with civil rights, the government is being told by the Constitution, okay, there are certain basic freedoms that the American public has, and you, the government, must do everything that you reasonably can to protect those freedoms. You, the government, with civil rights, must try to make sure that nobody else tries to take away people's civil rights. So you see the difference there? With civil liberties, the Constitution is telling government, no, 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 no. You, the government, can't take away basic freedoms from people. But with civil rights, the Constitution is telling the government the opposite thing, saying that people have these freedoms and you, the government, must protect those freedoms. You, the government, must make sure that other people don't take away people's civil rights. Two sides of the same coin. Does that make sense? Does everybody understand the basic similarity, but also the basic difference between civil liberties and civil rights? Any questions, comments, problems about that? Either open up your group, open up your microphone, or put your question or comment in the group chat. Does everybody see that basic distinction between civil liberties and civil rights? It's a really important one. Okay, now, since civil liberties and civil rights are two sides of the same coin, it makes sense that they are talked about in different parts of the Constitution. And as you go through the notes, both sets of notes that I've posted for you on Canvas for civil liberties and civil rights, and as you go through the assigned readings and look at the crash course videos as well, you will see that we have lots of these freedoms, but they are in different parts of the Constitution. As you will see, most of our civil liberties protections, that is, most of those things that government cannot do to us, are listed in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, Amendments 1 through 10. And these are things that the framers added to the Constitution for a couple of years after they originally wrote the Constitution in 1787. Whereas our civil rights protections, those things that government must do for us, the framers themselves didn't deal with civil rights at all. The framers said basically nothing when they wrote the Constitution about civil rights. We don't get civil rights protections added to the Constitution until right after the U.S. Civil War in the late 1860s and early 1870s. So as you will see from the notes, most of our civil rights protections are found in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Now, remember how we said at the beginning of the semester that the framers intentionally made it really difficult to amend the Constitution? It's really hard to add new language into the Constitution or take old language out. That shows you how important our civil rights protections are and our civil liberties protections. That if they were able to go through all the challenge and difficulty of amending the Constitution to put civil liberties and civil rights in, they were able to successfully get through that difficult process that we've only done 27 times in over 230 years. That shows you how important it is to have those basic freedoms stated in the Constitution. Okay? So those are the highlights for civil liberties and civil rights that I wanted to share with you this morning. So once you get done with your judicial branch discussion post for this week and start getting into the class notes on Canvas, the readings, and the crash course videos for civil liberties and civil rights, and I will be happy to deal with any additional questions or comments that you might have about civil liberties and civil rights during our regular class Zoom meeting next week. Okay, so remember, and I will be sending actually additional Canvas announcement out to all of you today or tomorrow, reminding you about upcoming assignments to finish up the semester. Remember, discussion forum post on the judicial branch due this Wednesday, plus the 3-day grace period. Next Wednesday, the 27th, you have your discussion forum post on civil liberties and civil rights due, plus the grace period. And also your student's choice project is due, plus the grace period. And then finally, 2 weeks from Wednesday, the very last day of the semester, Wednesday, June 3rd, your test number 3 is due, plus the grace period. Okay? So questions come up at any time, email me, send me a Canvas message, stop in during my virtual student hours on Zoom, Monday and Wednesday afternoons, including today, 2:30 to 3:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Get your questions answered. And please feel free to reach out to me at any time for any questions that you have about this class or for anything else that I might be able to help you with, even if it has absolutely nothing to do with this class or absolutely nothing to do with Long Beach City College. Remember, you are going to be successful in this class, and you are going to be successful in getting through these crazy times that we are currently living through, in part because of your hard work, because of your effort, because of your persistence, but because you are not alone. We are in this together. I'm here for you. I've got your back. So until the next time I talk to you, take care, be safe, and I'll see you soon. Thanks for joining me. Take care. Bye-bye.